Community check-in, quarter two community check-in. I am here to unpack all the events that have happened in terms of burnout and different events in the world and what we can do based off of what we know from this past quarter. So, my name is Camesha Jones Brandon. I am a licensed clinical social worker of a recovering workaholic and burnout overcomer. If you're joining me for the first time for Moving Beyond Burnout, please like the video, please share the video, and then also subscribe to the YouTube channel and my newsletter, which is in the description. So each quarter, I do a community check in. I started this, I believe, like last year to kind of recap all of the major events that have happened in our world that connect to mental health, that connect to burnout, and what we can do to prepare for the next season that we're headed into. So, this past quarter has been a continuation of chaos, confusion, and consistent shifts. When we started at the beginning of the year, we had a new presidential, administration, which for any country, when you have a new change in leadership, everyone knows that change is coming. However, the intensity and the aggressiveness of the change I think really shocked a lot of people. I was a little shocked. I wasn't like very shocked because of some of the research that I had been doing to prepare for kind of where things were headed with the country. And then if you go back to one of my videos early on in the year, it might have been one of my first videos in January. I talked about what was coming in 2025. And a lot of what I talked about actually, in fact, happened. We saw job loss and economic slowdown, which we know in America, our society mainly functions off of money, off of capitalism. So when there is an economic slowdown, it impacts us all. Even the billionaires and the millionaires, when there's an economic slowdown, everybody feels it. So that was a major thing. And a lot of the job loss from layoffs in the private sector and government in the public sector intensified during this past period. There was a job report released in April that shared that over 100,000 Black women have been laid off, lost their jobs since the beginning of the year. Dr. Avis DeWeaver, definitely follow her. She said that there's actually a report that came out on Axios. I think it may have been like 2 weeks ago that said 300,000 Black women lost their jobs, were laid off. And so it's really impacting our community. I began to see this really at the end of 2023, but people are losing their jobs and sometimes it's harder to find a new job. And in addition to that, with the economic slowdown, that impacts you even more when you are out of work. So that has been one of the most devastating things, I think, to the country, but particularly Black women. And I will also say that there's been a lot of change within sectors because of a lot of the loss of funding that was previously there before. So the job loss, the economic slowdown has led to people feeling very unstable in a variety of different ways and uncertain about the future. Another thing that happened this quarter that impacts mental health and burnout is political and social unrest. So with our community members that are undocumented, we saw these raids targeting of immigrants in our community, and that has been political unrest. Some of the proposed bill, they just had the big ugly bill that passed. Those changes have also created a lot of political unrest. So for so many, wherever you turn, there is some type of unrest or instability. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to respond to that. And then the last thing is survival mode. There is just a feeling in the air of urgency uncertainty and exhaustion. When I talk to some of my colleagues, some of my friends, everyone is talking about how exhausted they feel mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, all the above because of the intensity and the trauma of what a lot of people are experiencing right now. And the urgency comes from we need to move quick. We need to make a change quick because these changes are negatively impacting our daily lives. And even with basic needs. So in Chicago, the cost of living has gone up significantly. So we have clients that we see for therapy or who engage in services at Sysafia Community Care who are struggling with the very basics, finding housing that isn't, exuberant, finding jobs, finding food to put on the table. So the reverting back to being in survival mode. Some people have always been in survival mode, unfortunately, but I think there are more people entering survival mode during this time. So, I want to talk about a couple of pain points. In the newsletter that I released earlier today, I talked about a couple of pain points that I see across the board in terms of how people are impacted by this time period, impacted by what has happened in this last quarter. The first is fear. We know that a tool to divide, to conquer, to overtake is to create fear. And so, across the board, no matter what your background is, people are fearful right now. The other has been the dismantling of norms. So things that were considered normal are no longer normal anymore. When it comes to how do we engage with one another, compassion, rule of law, decency, order, those things are being dismantled in a way in our society that we have never seen. And there has been a shift in American culture to a countercultural but dismantling of norms that really distinguished our culture and our country. And of course, America, there's always been issues, and I'm African American, so we know it's been bad. But I think everyone else are starting to see that these dismantling of norms are more pronounced and more out there in the forefront and not covert anymore. They're very overt. Overt. And the last thing is hopelessness. I have seen so many folks just feeling hopeless about the future. Will I be able to, have a particular quality of life? Will things in the world, in terms of world relations, war, peace, will those things get better? There's just a lot of hopelessness that ties into the fear and the uncertainty and the dismantling of norms. So I know I just went over a lot of heavy stuff, but I want to kind of now shift to talking about how can we combat these things as we're moving into quarter three. And it took me a while to really reflect on this because I want to keep it real with you all, and I don't want to repeat the same talking points that we get in our circles, right? I want to go deeper with this and also be realist with you all as well. So, the first thing I want to talk about is combating fear. Um, I was recently reading a book, and it talked about how the tool of fear totally disrupts and can dismantle our sense of self and our well being, and just our outlook on life. And with combating fear, one of the anecdotes to combat fear is building individual and collective power. Individual power, when we feel like we have agency, when we have control, and feel empowered in our lives, it affects how we show up every day. It affects how we relate to one another, and it affects how we move through certain situations. Also, collective power. Last year, after it was announced that Trump would be in office, a lot of people were talking about we need community, we need community, we need community, which is interesting because America culture is still very individualistic. And for me, as somebody who's been in community mental health, who really values community, it was kind of interesting to me to see, a shift after, devastating things happen. Now we need community. But I think that more people are still really trying to understand what it looks like to build your community, to build collective power, resilience, and faith during this time. And some of it looks like people doing community organizing. Sometimes it looks like mutual aid. Sometimes it looks like spending more time with people who really care about you. And that is a part of collective power. When we don't feel isolated, when we don't feel alone in what we're navigating in life, our power builds collectively. The other thing that I want to talk about is naming what we are fearful about. Because of the onslaught of the chaos, the confusion, the constant shifts that people are encountering, there are so many fears that are coming up that we don't even name. And one of the most important aspects of combating fear is to name it and to understand how it's impacting your daily life and your actions. When I think about money, right, and when you don't have enough money, you struggle with being able to really focus and think about how to approach everyday situations, because that fear is always in the back of your head. And so it can show up in how, your mood and how you relate to other people and the decisions that you make. And there's no right or wrong, but to just truly name, okay, I'm fearful about, am I going to be able to keep my job? I'm fearful about my rent going up. I'm fearful about the state of the world. Just to call it out there and name it is really powerful and important. And to understand how it connects to your daily actions. How does it connect to your behaviors, your thoughts, how you feel mentally, emotionally, and spiritually? And I believe when we can name it and we can make connections to it, that awareness helps us to be able to move differently or try to change course, especially if it's really interrupting our day-to-day lives. So, combating the dismantling of norms. So, what do we do to combat the norms that we've had, for quite some time, maybe decades, to norms that can be aggressive, that can be harmful, that can shift our society as we know it. And what I realized was that we have gotten so used to being reactive to what's happening. Um, Even me doing this video is like a little bit reactive, right? But what I have found is that when we are in reactive mode, emotionally, I mean, sometimes I can't even look at the news for too long because I feel my heart and I feel the blood boiling, because it really, really upsets me and I want to react to it. Which everybody needs time and space to feel what they feel, to sit in their anger, their rage, their emotions about what's happening. But I believe that being strategic and proactive is what is going to sustain us for what's coming. At the end of the year, I'm a executive director of a nonprofit, and I knew that shifts were coming. And one of the things that I did to help me to be able to not be as reactive, but to try to be proactive and strategic, is because that's what they don't want you to be. They don't want us to be strategic or proactive. They want us to constantly be reacting, and that we're not able to really combat what's happening. So I started to do a lot of reading about the current administration, their plans, a lot of reading about our ancestors and what they went through, tapping into wisdom of existing people who are elders who went through way worse than what we're experiencing now, or maybe a different iteration of it, at least. And what I realized was that even in thinking about like the civil rights movement, it was a very strategic, reactive a very strategic. There were some parts of it that were reactive, but they were incredibly strategic. And that is why they won in some regards, right? It was because of that power to strategize and to react to what's happening, but that not be the main part of a movement. So I do think right now, we need to get into a space where we can strategize and be as proactive and get ahead of as much as possible. And I know it's a lot, it's tiring. I'm tired of doing it, to be honest, but it's going to be a part of how we win. So I want you all to think about, how can you get in your strategy mind? How can you get in your proactive mind? Yes, make space for the reaction. Yes, make space for the emotions. But also, how do we shift to also be strategic? And I think that's really lacking right now, and it shows on in all areas, And then the last thing that I want to touch on is about combating hopelessness. What do we do when we feel hopeless? What do we do when we feel like everything is, as they would say, going to S word, right? And so, what I believe helps us to build hope is our relationships with other people. I talked about community a little bit earlier on, which is a part of collective power. But building, collaborating, and sustaining our relationships gives us hope. When we have people who are in there with us, when we're sharing resources, we're collaborating, we're filling in gaps, we're building powerful, sustainable, loving relationships in all assets, all facets of our lives. That is what can combat hopelessness, because a tool is to keep us isolated. A tool is to keep us not engaged with one another. And that it makes it easy to be overpowered. But I really want people to lean into your relationships, and not just interpersonal. I'm talking about community, I'm talking about work. If you're in a faith community, whatever relationship you had, lean into that. And so, finally, I want to conclude that this is not the first time that this has happened. What we're going through now is just another iteration of what's happened in the past. I think for some people may be experiencing it for the first time, but for some people, this is very familiar. And so, we read about these things in our history books, and we're like, wow, I couldn't imagine what that could have been like. Or for some people, they may gloss it over, like, oh, it's not a big deal. That would never happen here. It's happening. So I want people to understand that if this is not the first time that this has happened, there is something that we can lean into in terms of wisdom from past experiences, from recent experiences, because there have been moments of winning. Even though there's been steps forward, there have also been steps back, and it's a back and forth, and it's exhausting, right? To have to constantly go back and forth with progress, right? But this is not the first time that this has happened. And I want to reiterate that so many times. And so, leaning into the wisdom in your families, leaning into the wisdom that has been left for us. I think a lot of leaders and people in our communities have left us with something that we may not even really fully have tapped into or value. Um, every generation that has had their fight, that has had their challenges that impact burnout, that impact mental health, that impact stability, they left something with us. And so I want you to think about what has been left to us. What have the people in the past, what have they done, and what have they left with us to be able to carry forward? So really beginning to identify what that is for you in your circle of, power, your circle of connection, because I believe that is the missing piece of what has been left to us, and how can we gain wisdom from what has been left to move us forward. So, overall, a lot has happened this past quarter. How we combat what is happening is building individual and collective power, naming fear and leaning into and understanding how it impacts our actions, getting in our strategy and our proactive minds instead of our reactive emotions all of the time, and building and collaborating and sustaining the relationships that we do have. So those are how we can combat the challenges that we had for this past quarter. What's coming in quarter three? I didn't actually make a little banner about that. What I can tell you about what's coming in quarter three, I think it's going to be a lot of what's happened in quarter two. But I think that it this summer, and the summer is always there's always a lot going on, you know, in the summer in terms of unrest and political movement. But I think that this summer is really, really going to be critical, for us to look at what has happened these past 6 months and to strategically move in whatever way that looks like, personally, politically, socially, in work, based off of what we've already learned, and to begin to make shifts and changes internally, to be able to make it through the rest of this year. Because some people, when I talk about what's going on, they're like, man, this only been 6 months. This feels like 6 years, right? And that's how they want us to feel. But there's so much that we have just learned these past 6 months. And so I think that quarter three is a critical time for us to begin to build our individual and our collective power, to build our relationships, to focus on our well-being. I don't want to get here and say the usual talking points about rest and joy and all that. Yes, we know that. But our rituals, what we do every day, is going to be able to sustain us through what we're going to face. In whatever way that looks like for you, it doesn't have to be rest. It doesn't have to be joy. It can be everything and all in between. But most importantly for quarter three is like, we really got to focus, y'all. We really got to focus. We really have to do a lot of soul searching and preparing for what's going to come, because there is going to be more. And so what I can tell you of going into quarter three is getting in a reflective and a strategy space, and being able to begin to implement those things going forward in your mental health, in your physical health, your relationships, your work, whatever. This is the time of reflection and preparing for implementation. So yeah, that's what I can tell you about quarter three, about what lies ahead. I do think that things are going to get more intense from a survival mode purpose, and that's why this time period of reflection is really critical. So next, for the next 2 months, I'm going to have a power series. So I'm going to be talking about the power of certain things. So every time I come, every 2 weeks, I'm going to be talking about power, and wellness. So my first one, which is going to be on the 17th, is going to be the power of contentment. The power of contentment. In a world where everyone says more, 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 what does it mean to be content? And how does that factor into your mental health? And how does that factor into burnout? So that is going to be my first one. That'll be in 2 weeks at 5 p.m. Central Time here on LinkedIn and YouTube and Instagram. So please join me for that. I went a little bit longer today than I thought I was going to. I hope that's okay with you all. But join me every other Thursday at 5 p.m. Central. Please like the video. Please share the video. Please subscribe to my newsletter on LinkedIn. I release it every 2 weeks. It kind of talks about what I'm going to be talking about, and it's also reflections on anything related to mental health, burnout, wellness over the past couple of weeks. So I hope that you all enjoy this weekend, this holiday weekend, and take good care of yourself. And I'll see you in a couple weeks.